At that time, ancient Roman sculptures were often unearthed by workmen digging around the city. Julius had quite a collection of them. One day Michelangelo was at the house of his friend, the architect Sangallo, when a message came from the Pope. Julius wanted them to go and see what had just been discovered among the ruins of the Emperor Nero's golden house. Hurrying to the spot, they were stunned by what they found. "It is the Laocoon mentioned by Pliny," Sangallo cried. Indeed, they were looking at the very sculpture described by the ancient writer as the greatest sculpture ever made. It had been lost since the time of the Roman Empire. The three figures, the Trojan priest Laocoon and his two sons, writhed frantically in a death struggle with terrible serpents. Michelangelo was amazed by the beautiful technique and the perfect understanding of anatomy. But what impressed him most was the extraordinary sense of movement. How very different it was from the calm elegance of his David and Pieta. Michelangelo's mark. Inspired by this miracle of sculpture, Michelangelo now threw himself excitedly into his work on the tomb. It is probably just as well that he did not know when he first began on that great project how dearly it would cost him, that it would haunt him for 40 years, tarnish his reputation, break his spirit, and cast a shadow over his old age. His biographer Condivi called it the tragedy of the tomb. Michelangelo was a perfectionist, and for such an important commission he wanted only the best marble. So he went to Carrara, famous for its marble since Roman times, and stayed there for 8 months, with 2 helpers and a horse and no provision other than food, to supervise the stone cutting. Julius had paid him a certain amount of money in advance, and this Michelangelo used to buy the stone and have it shipped to Rome. But there were additional expenses that came out of his own pocket. He had, for example, hired several apprentices from Florence to work with him on the tomb, and they had to be paid. He had to buy beds and chairs and other things for the apprentices, and did so assuming that Julius would pay him back. Then, with no warning, the Pope dropped the project, announcing that he would not spend another copper on stones. Julius had been persuaded that it would be bad luck to build his tomb during his lifetime. An idea that Michelangelo believed had been planted by a rival artist, the Pope's architect Donato Bramante. The presumed motive was to divert more of the Pope's money toward his own great commission, for Bramante had been chosen to buy the new St. Peter's, and away from buying marble for the tomb. Though Michelangelo had lost his job, at least he expected to be paid, so he went to see Julius day after day, and each time was told to come back later. On the 5th visit he wasn't even allowed to see the Pope, but was sent away by a servant. Beside himself with rage, Michelangelo rushed home, quickly arranged to sell his furniture, then wrote the following letter to the Pope. "Most blessed Father, I have this morning been driven out of the palace on behalf of your holiness, whence I wish you to understand that from now on, if you want me, you will seek me elsewhere than in Rome." And then he left. Coat of arms of Pope Julius II. The Pope sent 5 men-at-arms after Michelangelo, but by the time they reached him he had safely crossed the border into Florentine territory. Julius, a stubborn man, wanted Michelangelo back. He began sending letters to the Council of Florence, demanding his return. After the 3rd letter in 7 months, the council begged Michelangelo to leave. "You've tried and tested the Pope as not even the King of France would dare," they said. "We don't want to go to war with him over you." This remark was not meant as a joke. Julius was known as the warrior Pope, and he was at that very moment with his army in the city of Bologna, which he had just reconquered after a rebellion. And that is where, reluctantly, Michelangelo went to beg the Pope's forgiveness. Julius accepted his apology, then put him back to work, but not on the tomb, of course. The Pope wanted him to cast a giant bronze statue of himself, an odious task for Michelangelo, who didn't do portraits and hated to work in bronze. When it was done, Julius called him back to Rome for an even more unpleasant job. Michelangelo was to decorate the ceiling of a great chapel named the Sistine after its builder, Pope Sixtus IV. It was a most important and holy place, for it was there that the cardinals convened for the solemn task of electing new popes. Its walls had already been beautifully decorated by a number of other artists, including Michelangelo's old master, Ghirlandaio. But the ceiling, painted pale blue with a pattern of gold stars, was not very interesting. Michelangelo was disheartened by the very thought of this undertaking. He didn't really want to paint anything, most especially not a ceiling. This had to be Bramante's doing, Michelangelo thought, to set him a task that would cost little, take a long time, and be very uncomfortable too. and since Michelangelo had so little experience in fresco painting, there was always the chance he would fail. While the workers set up the scaffolding in the chapel and plastered over the existing decoration, Michelangelo began planning his general design. Once he had a scheme he was pleased with, he began sketching the individual scenes and figures in detail. Though he often used live models for this, he also liked to make little figures out of wax or clay. He was a sculptor, after all, so he could study the way light fell upon the forms. After about 6 months of preparation, Michelangelo was ready to get started. It was a very big ceiling, 5,800 square feet, so he hired 5 assistants from Florence to help him paint it. But this arrangement didn't last long. He soon grew impatient with the assistants who could not possibly live up to his standards and sent them home. Their work can still be seen, clearly less skilled than Michelangelo's in parts of the 3 panels depicting the life of Noah. From that point on, using helpers for only the most mechanical and mindless tasks, Michelangelo proceeded to paint the rest of the ceiling by himself. For the next 4 years, he spent all his waking hours more than 60 feet up in the air. He did not paint lying down, as many people believed, but standing in a most uncomfortable position. He even wrote a poem about it, illustrated with a little sketch. His back was bent like a bow, he said, his beard pointed toward heaven, and my paintbrush all the day doth drip a rich mosaic on my face. He ate merely to keep his body going, nibbling on a piece of bread as he worked. At night he was so tired he would fall into bed, with his clothes on, even to the tall boots. At certain seasons he kept these boots on for such a length of time that, when he drew them off, the skin came away together with the leather like that of a sloughing snake. He fretted constantly about money and had twice to go all the way to Bologna to ask the Pope to pay him. To his brother he wrote, "I live here in great toil and great weariness of body, and have no friends of any kind, and don't want any, and haven't the time to eat what I need." The painter Raphael, who both envied and admired Michelangelo, called him lonely as a hangman. Toward the end, Julius grew impatient for the ceiling to be finished. Perhaps he sensed the nearness of his own death and wanted to see the miracle that was in progress up there. Though he could climb the ladder to the top of the scaffolding and inspect the work up close, he wanted to see the whole thing spread out above him. "When will you finish?" he would ask again and again. "When I can," was always the answer. Finally, when Julius threatened to have the artist thrown from the scaffolding if he didn't stop painting, Michelangelo declared the ceiling finished. On October 31st, 1512, the chapel was opened to the public. They crowded inside, curious and excited, to see what Michelangelo had been doing up there for the last 4 years. This is what they saw. Around the edge of the ceiling, he had painted the biblical ancestors of Jesus and dramatic scenes from the Bible. Between them were massive figures of the Hebrew prophets and pagan symbols who foretold the coming of Christ. This frame of exquisite images led the eye up to the vast central space that stretched across the length of the chapel. Here, in 9 separate panels, Michelangelo told the great biblical story of creation and destruction. In the first 3 panels, God made the heavens and the earth. Then came the story of man, from the creation of Adam and Eve to the temptation by the serpent and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. The last 3 panels dealt with the life of Noah and the story of the flood, balancing creation on one end with destruction on the other. Michelangelo had worked it out neatly so that the creation part of the ceiling rested over the altar, while the saga of human downfall rested over the heads of the people. Michelangelo had painted the ceiling in reverse, starting with the flood and ending with the separation of light from darkness. Halfway through, the scaffolding had been taken down and moved to the other half of the chapel, giving Michelangelo his first chance to view the work from ground level. As a result of what he saw, he approached the second half differently, making the figures much larger and the scenes simpler so they are easier to see from a distance. His style changed too, gradually becoming more confident and bold. To study the Sistine ceiling is to watch a genius learning how to paint. Only 4 months later, Pope Julius died. The time had now arrived for Michelangelo to build his tomb. Though it had been 4 years since he had worked at sculpture, Michelangelo had been storing up ideas. While he was covering the Sistine ceiling with hundreds of marvelous figures in many dramatic poses, he imagined them in 3 dimensions. Now he would render them in marble. He began by carving 2 captive slaves. They were meant to symbolize the arts, which at the death of Julius would lose their greatest patron and thus become prisoners of death. With these 2 beautiful sculptures, Michelangelo had moved beyond mere perfection in anatomy. The figures seemed to move and breathe, twisting dramatically, the legs turning in one direction, the torso in another. This technique, used by the Greeks, is called contrapposto. Next he made a seated Moses, so fierce and powerful, so full of energy, you half expect him to leap up from his throne and speak. He too was born in the Sistine Chapel, for he could easily be one of those massive prophets who had somehow managed to step off the ceiling and been magically turned to stone. It is tempting to wonder what Michelangelo might have done next if he had continued, but instead, once again, he entered the service of the Pope. Rebellious slave. This new Pope, Leo X, was no stranger to Michelangelo, being none other than his old schoolmate Giovanni de' Medici, the clever, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni had gotten an early start on his path to greatness. Thanks to Lorenzo's influence, he had been made an archbishop at the age of 9 and a cardinal at 13, all leading toward his final promotion to the supreme head of the Catholic Church. Since Leo was a Medici, one of the projects that naturally occurred to him was the decoration of the unfinished front of the family's church, San Lorenzo in Florence. Michelangelo submitted a design for the new church facade, which was readily accepted. Then, insisting on complete control over the project, he went to the quarry to choose the marble. Unfortunately, the Pope insisted he used a new quarry, one that belonged to Florence. This caused endless delays, with the building of new roads to get the marble out and the blunders of untrained workmen. Michelangelo had spent the better part of 3 years there, taming the mountains, as he called it, when the project was abruptly cancelled. He was stunned by the enormous insult of having been brought here to execute the said work and then having it taken away from me. And he added, I still do not know why. Historians don't either, and to this day the front of the church of San Lorenzo is still unadorned. Frieze from the Medici Chapel. The logical thing to do at that point would have been to go back to Rome and finish the tomb. Instead, Michelangelo agreed to remain in Florence and build the Medici Chapel, in which would lie the mortal remains of his old patron Lorenzo, as well as those of his son and grandson. Later he was asked to design a beautiful library for the Medici collection of books and manuscripts. Michelangelo would work on these two projects off and on for the next 13 years, through the sack of Rome, the fall of the Florentine Republic, the reign of 2 more popes, an epidemic of the plague, and the deaths of his father and his brother, and into his old age. Popes came and went at a rapid pace in those days. Just as Michelangelo was starting work on the Medici Chapel, Pope Leo died. His successor lasted only 2 years, to be followed in turn by a second Medici Pope, Lorenzo's nephew, Giulio, who now became Clement VII. His reign would not be an easy one. Just 4 years after his election, the army of Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, marched into Rome. Many of the soldiers were Germans, followers of the new Protestant faith. They went wild with religious rage, burning and looting churches, turning the Sistine Chapel into a stable, and murdering priests and nuns and thousands of innocent citizens. By the time Pope Clement made peace with the emperor, Rome was in ashes, and in the opinion of many historians, the Renaissance was over. Florence, too, was in turmoil. Taking advantage of Clement's weakness, the people once again threw out the Medici and established a republic. But the Pope's weakness was only temporary, and it wasn't long before he was marching north with his army to take the city back. The Florentines set to work repairing the city walls and planning their defense. It was common in those days for artists to work as military engineers because they were trained in architecture, so Michelangelo was put in charge of the fortifications. Soon he began to hear rumors among the soldiers that cast suspicion upon the loyalty of their commander-in-chief. Convinced that the rumors were true, Michelangelo went before the city council and denounced the man as a traitor. The council dismissed the idea as ridiculous, but word of his accusation quickly spread. One morning, as Michelangelo later told it, a certain person came, where I was attending to the bastions, and whispered in my ear that if I meant to save my life, I must not stay in Florence. He brought me horses and never left my side till he got me outside the city. Michelangelo stayed away for 2 months. Only when his safety was assured did he return to Florence, just in time for a 10-month siege that ended in defeat. From that time on, Florence would be ruled by Medici dukes, never to be a republic again. It probably did not comfort Michelangelo to learn that he had been right. Their commander really was a traitor. Michelangelo's plans for the fortifications. When he was almost 60, Michelangelo left Florence for the last time. The Medici Chapel was still unfinished. The 6 marble sculptures he had managed to complete lay scattered about the room. Michelangelo settled in Rome, where he hoped once and for all to finish Julius's tomb. But it was not to be. Pope Clement died, and his successor, Paul III, was eager to employ Michelangelo. When he tried to refuse, the Pope lost his temper. "For 30 years I have wanted this," Paul thundered, "and now that I am Pope, will you disappoint me?" And so once again Michelangelo set the tomb aside to paint a fresco in the Sistine Chapel. This project had originally been conceived by Pope Clement, but Michelangelo had never gotten beyond the sketching stage. Now he began in earnest the enormous task of filling the entire back wall of the chapel, more than 2,000 square feet, with a dramatic and chilling scene, the Last Judgment. High above the altar, Michelangelo painted a wrathful Christ surrounded by saints and angels, his right arm upraised as if to smite the wicked. Below, bodies rise and fall in a furious swirl, the blessed pulled up from the earth toward heaven, while hideous demons drag the sinners down into hell. Michelangelo even painted himself into the picture in a most gruesome way. His is the dark, distorted face on the flayed skin held by Saint Bartholomew. The painting is so vivid and terrifying that when Pope Paul saw it, he fell to his knees and prayed for mercy. But others found it shocking. One of the Pope's officials remarked that a picture with that many naked bodies in it belonged in a public house instead of the Pope's chapel. Michelangelo was so annoyed by this comment that he painted the man into the picture in hell, naturally. He is shown naked with the ears of a donkey in the grip of a hideous snake. The censors won the battle in the end, though. Just a few years later, an artist was hired to cover the shameful parts with little draperies. Michelangelo had always lived the life of a hermit. He did not care for fine food or clothes and sent most of his money back to Florence to support his father and brothers. Yet he seems to have done this more out of duty than affection. His letters home are all about business and money, with repeated complaints about how hard he is working to provide for the family. As he got older, Michelangelo grew suspicious and rude, coldly rejecting his nephew's gifts. He accused the poor boy of waiting greedily for him to die, hoping to inherit his money. Nor had Michelangelo found companionship in marriage. "I already have a wife," he once said, "who is too much for me, one who keeps me unceasingly struggling on. It is my art, and my works are my children." It is truly remarkable, then, that as he neared old age this lonely and tormented man should suddenly fall into the kind of deep and loving friendship that had eluded him all his life. And more amazing still, it happened not once but twice. The first of these friendships was with Vittoria Colonna, a high-born widow of middle age. She was an intellectual, a noted poet, and a very refined and devout woman. She stirred his spirit and stimulated his mind. With Vittoria, as with no one else, he could speak of the solemn things that lay in the troubled heart of a man moving ever closer to the end of life. When Michelangelo was 70, Vittoria Colonna died, leaving him despondent. He had lost, he wrote, "the great fire which burned and nourished me." The other friendship was with Tommaso Cavalieri, a handsome young nobleman of great intelligence, grace, and kindness. He represented for Michelangelo the absolute ideal of human perfection. Michelangelo wrote ardent poems to Tommaso and gave him gifts of beautiful drawings. This devoted friendship lasted for more than 30 years, and when death came for Michelangelo, Tommaso was at his side. St. Peter's Cathedral. In February 1545, the tragedy of the tomb finally came to an end with the official unveiling of the monument to Julius. The original design had been cut down to something small and manageable, with only 3 sculptors from Michelangelo's hand. Though one of them, the Moses, surely ranks among the greatest works of all time, still the tomb as a whole was disappointing. Michelangelo himself was ashamed of it, as apparently were the heirs of Julius, for the Pope's bones lie elsewhere. Michelangelo was then 70 years old and so famous that people were already summing up his accomplishments and considering his place in history. Every public figure has critics, and Michelangelo had his share, like the writer who complained that all of his figures were equally massive and muscular, men, women, and children alike. "Whoever sees one figure by Michelangelo," he wrote, "sees them all." To almost everyone else, though, he was a divine Michelangelo, a living legend, the master of the Renaissance. Yet old though he was, the crowning achievement of his remarkable life still lay ahead. In 1547, Pope Paul appointed him chief architect of St. Peter's. It had been more than 40 years since Bramante first began work on the new church, and construction had been going on all that time. To protect the tomb of St. Peter, over which the church was built, a miniature classical structure had been erected. Beyond that, very little had been accomplished, for after Bramante died, a string of architects followed, each changing the previous design and starting over again. Now this commission, the most important of the age, fell to Michelangelo. He would work on St. Peter's for the rest of his life. When he was 82, knowing that he would never live to see it finished, Michelangelo constructed a model of the great dome for the builders to follow. Even as he neared the age of 90, Michelangelo still rode out to the site every day. Old age is not easy for anyone. Most of Michelangelo's friends had died and his health was beginning to fail. What sustained him then, more than anything else, was his daily work on St. Peter's, that miracle of architecture. And though he devoted the last 17 years of his life to this task, Michelangelo refused to accept any payment. He said he did it for the good of his soul. In his last years, he would still go into his studio sometimes and pick up his hammer and chisel. The vigor that once enabled him to knock more chips out of the hard-set marble in a quarter of an hour than 3 young masons could have done in an hour was a thing of the past. Still, he went on working at his craft because it gave him pleasure, and it is fitting that he should end the cycle of his great works exactly as he began it, with the Pietà. But this one he would not finish. Shortly before his death, Michelangelo burned some of his poems along with many of his drawings, sketches, and cartoons. Perhaps he didn't want anyone to see all the work that went into the creation of his finished paintings. Or maybe he was echoing those bonfires of the vanities from his youth, for by then his thoughts had begun to turn toward the next world and the salvation of his soul. On February 18th, 1564, feeling restless and feverish, Michelangelo sat down to make his will. He left his soul to God, his body to the earth, and his goods to his nearest relatives. To his friends, gathered to support him in his final hours, he spoke of how much he regretted dying just as I am beginning to learn the alphabet of my profession. Then, shortly before 5, on a chilly winter afternoon, as he sat in a comfortable chair by the fire, Michelangelo died at the age of 89. In an age of great artists, he was perhaps the greatest, creating immortal works in all 3 of the major arts: sculpture, painting, and architecture. Not even Leonardo da Vinci could match him in that. Yet near the end of his life, Michelangelo looked on those great works of art to which he had devoted his life as of little value, but then, with a touch of pride, he added, "They will last for a while." This they have certainly done.